To participate with us today, whether you're participating online or if you're here in person. We're thrilled that you're here. We are going to continue. Can you get me to the right place in the slides there? We are not where we want to be. All right, there we go. We're in a better place now. Even the booth had to wake up. All right, so here we go. No digs, Mike, sorry. I appreciate what you do. It's November, finally, right? Everybody excited about that? Boy, I am. 3 more days. Man, I can't wait till it's all over. Anyway, welcome again to Sunday School. It's 1st November. We have a verse of the month. Our verse of the month is this, Joshua 1:9. Bruce alluded to it last week. Have I not commanded thee, be strong and of good courage. Be not afraid, neither be thou dismayed. For the Lord thy God is with thee, whithersoever thou goest. It is important to know, isn't it? Because the focus today, we're going to be talking about God's presence and God being with the people. And so knowing he's near should bring a sense of comfort and relief. And sometimes that's true and other times it's not. But I thought about a couple of questions as I was going into this, and I think, sometimes, do you ever find yourself wondering if God is really near? Is he really near? Is he really there for me? Is he listening to my prayers? Is he going to help me? You begin to think about those questions, and as they come to our minds, I want you to understand that we can depend on God, and we can depend on his promises. And so today, again, our focus is on God's provision, and it's focused on the children of Israel, but there's a good broad application in this. God can do great things when we trust him. I'm reminded of what it says in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5. This is from the New King James. Let your conduct be without covetous. Be content with such things as you have, for he himself has said, this is the part I want to draw your attention to, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Now that's comforting in a time when we wonder, is God really near? Well, again, Bruce alluded to some of this last week. There were 40 years in the wilderness. The children of Israel were there. Moses died. Joshua's transitioning to leadership. So all these things are beginning to happen. And, these are milestones that require somewhat of a response. But they offer us an opportunity to learn as well, and I think that that's important for us. How do we learn from the past and stay focused on the future? An interesting dynamic playing out there. I'm reminded of what Albert Einstein says. He's famous for saying this, and it is this phrase, and as we think about the children of Israel, I want you to think about them in terms of disobedience as we apply this. But he said, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And as we go through the Old Testament, as we study, you see the children of Israel go, they obey, then they disobey, then they obey, then they disobey. And so, again, this idea, can we learn from that cycle and break that cycle? Becomes a real challenge for us to think about. Well, Joshua chapter 2 and verse 24 from the New Living Translation is on the screen there. The Lord has given us the whole land, they said. For all the people in the land are terrified of us. Remember, they're getting ready to cross over in Canaan land. And so the spies had given them a message and told them that this is what's going, these people are afraid of us. So we need to move, we need to act. Now is the time to respond. Well, Joshua was, the report was good, and he's glad about that. And the response comes down to really trusting. Trusting is the word that I have underlined there, that God is near, and that he's going to provide everything that's needed. Now, why is that important? Well, this is a big commitment. It's a commitment based on knowing that God has already been actively engaged in life's events. Now, I don't know about these folks that had been wandering for 40 years in the wilderness. Have they thought about this in terms of this was God's judgment on them, and they, would we really get out of this? Is there relief coming? And maybe you can relate to that in terms of looking at the past, and it seems like the past is just always a part of your present, and we want to figure out how do we get beyond that point. Well, I'm glad you asked, because the key truth number one for this lesson is this: God provides guidance for what lies ahead. We find this in Joshua chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. You have Joshua 3:3 from the New Living Translation. Part of it's on the screen there. When you see the Levitical priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God, move out from your positions and follow them. Follow the Ark. Now, why is that important? Well, for those of you who are Bible students, you know that the Ark was symbolic for the children of Israel. It served as a representation of God's presence. It had God's commandments as a part of it. So with this charge, to take the land, it was important and probably critical to know that they had a plan to follow. And so as they're putting this together, think again about this fact that God's been preparing them to take a land that was promised. This land that they're going to take was promised to them. God was going to be their guide. Well, there's a picture of the ark, a rendering of that. If you didn't know what it looked like, very ornate, and it had Aaron's rod that budded, it had the container of manna in it, and it had the tablets of the commandments in it. So again, all representations of God's provision and what God could do. Well, again, where do we go? Following the ark is going to be a key to this. How the people would navigate and how they would deal with the obstacles that they faced. The directions that they received they were very scripted. It's not like they had to figure it out. Joshua is going to convey to them the things that the Lord has shared with him. And it goes down to the distance. As you read Joshua chapter 3, it goes down to even the distance that they should stay from the ark. Now, it's important to think about that for a moment. You're going to follow the Levites, you're going to purify yourself, and then you're going to move forward. And so the goal was to allow for everyone to see the ark. That's why the distance is there. About a half mile, I think, as I recall, from the scriptures. And so, the Jordan River is flooded. It's at flood stage. So it's important that they all be able to see the ark. Isn't that what we want for people today? That everyone could see God. That's what we want. Because if they see God and they follow God, their life will be different. So critically important. Well, again, the goal was to allow for everyone to see the ark and to follow. And since the Jordan is at flood stage, would following the ark be easy? No. Interesting question, isn't it? Because if I fast forward to today, doing the right thing is not always easy to do. It is the right thing to do, but it's not always easy. And we need to be able to follow and do the right thing even when there are obstacles ahead of you. Now, imagine you are in this congregation of people that Joshua is talking to. And he says, okay, buckle up. We are going to Canaan land. And the first thing out of your mouth is, Joshua, have you seen the River Jordan? It's at flood stage, and, I'm not quite sure how we're going to get there. There are people that think like that. Not that, all right, God said it, it's ours, let's take it. And so there were people probably in the crowd that felt that way. And, you've got the Jordan River, you've got fortified cities, and you got all these people. How are we going to get the land that God has promised? And I love what you find in Joshua chapter 3 and verse 5, the tail end of that verse, again from the New Living Translation. Tomorrow the Lord will do great wonders among you. Now there's many in the room probably that could testify to the fact that God has done great things in your life, and he's done great things for you. And you know that, and you can see that, and you're a witness to that. I want you to keep that in mind, because here are folks that are going to have to cross this flooded Jordan, and the question probably popped up, okay, Joshua, we got the command, but how are we going to do this? The water is deep, and the river is wide, and how are we going to get across? Well, and there are enemies, by the way, Joshua, you did know that, right? That there are enemies over there and taking a land that was promised. I don't think they're just going to, fall over and let us have this land. I think there's going to be some trouble there. These are obstacles, aren't they? You know, in our lives sometimes, the way ahead really may not always be clear, but we can trust God to lead us. It's so important. Hebrews 13:5, going back to that last part of that verse, I will never leave you and I will never forsake you. Well, let's think for a moment about Joshua. He was communicating with God, and he had a vision. And when we think about leaders who have a vision, they are leaders who are praying or listening for God to guide them. So important, isn't it? Because we could all have an idea. I could go around the room, we all have different ideas, and we could all say, okay, this is the way we're going to go, this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to do it. But that's my idea, you know, and is it something that has been, is it the vision, is it what God wants? And I need to stay tuned into that because it truly is about the timing. Remember, I got the flooded Jordan, I got fortified cities. This seems like something I can't get over. Well, notice what Joshua says to the people. He says, listen, in the morning Joshua said to the priests, lift up the ark of the covenant and lead the people across the river. Now, if I'm one of those Levites, I'm like, okay, Joshua, I hope you know what you're talking about. Because that water is deep, it's cold, it's rushing, it's fast. What are we going to do? And so they started out and went ahead of the people. So they're doing what they've been told to do. They are following the leadership of Joshua, who is following the leadership of God. So important, isn't it? Would the people be obedient even when obstacles ahead of them seem to be sort of insurmountable? Well, just think about that for a moment. And maybe you're in the crowd and you say, excuse me, Mr. Joshua, can we talk? Have you seen the Jordan River lately? You know, it's kind of deep. Well, again, this idea of prayer, in vision, in obedience, these things are important to the believer and to the church. You know, again, fast forward. We're talking about the children of Israel. They were following their leader, Joshua, and, they were dependent on the fact that he was a praying man and he was in communication with God. So it is with us today as the church. We want to make sure that our leaders are prayerful and we're following the vision that God has lined out for us. We're being obedient. Well, the Levites, what do? They pick up the ark and they step into the water. Wow. Now, sometimes leaders have to step out in faith to see God work. The path is not always clear, is it? I think about, and just to think about it in the mornings when I get up sometimes to drive to work, my windshield has dew on it, and pretty soon it'll be frost. I can't see clearly through it. I have to wait and allow, things to change. Well, in this instance, it was like, okay, I know what's ahead of you. Am I going to depend on what God is saying? Am I going to move forward? Notice what he says, when you reach the banks of the Jordan River, take a few steps into the river and stop. Okay, now Joshua, I'm very confused. I thought we were going across. I didn't think you wanted me to just get into the water. But that's what he says. Take a few steps and stop. Well, again, it is about God leading the people. I want to take you to Matthew chapter 17 and verse 20 for a moment. And it says this, for verily I say unto you, if you have faith as a grain of mustard seed. You know that part of that verse, don't you? Stepping out in faith, trusting God's timing, trusting God's presence to be with you. Joshua and the Levites were going to be that example. They were working together to accomplish great things. And so it is in our world today. Who are we working with and how are we working together to accomplish things for the kingdom of God? Well, again, they had been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. They're on the one side of the Jordan. They got to get across to the other side of Jordan. What's the best way to get somewhere if you haven't been there before? Well, you listen to Siri, right? Or you listen to Alexa or whoever your GPS is. It's with guidance from someone who knows the way. And so it is. Ask. If you have a GPS in your car, okay, I can program it. This is where I want to go. And it'll talk to me. Not literally, but it gives me these directions back. And I just need to listen and follow. And I think I've shared before out here, sometimes I'm looking at surroundings and I'm thinking, okay, well, that doesn't seem right. I'm going to go this way. And it'll tell me in a nice way, recalculating. But if I don't follow the one that knows the way, it's going to be an issue, isn't it? Isaiah chapter 40, verse 31 from the King James is on the screen. They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint. Obedience to God is always the best choice. Well, as church leaders are recognized for preaching and service, remember that their vision of where we are going is also important. It's important to have vision as a leader. Joshua was sensitive to God's guidance, and he was obedient. And so if I'm obedient to God, God's always going to lead, and his presence will be with me, and I can trust that. It makes a difference, doesn't it? Well, God makes a way when there's no way. He's all-powerful. We know that's one of his attributes. And how should I view obstacles that are in my path? Well, Joshua was depending on God. Joshua 3:9, look, the ark of the covenant which belongs to the Lord of the whole earth will lead you across the Jordan River. Joshua was the messenger, but it was God's provision that was making the difference. Take the ark, step into the water. What happens when they step into the water? An amazing thing happens. They took that step of faith, just like most in the room when you came to know who Jesus was. You had to take that first step. You take that step of faith and things change. So they took the step, and all of a sudden the waters built up as a wall so that everyone could get across. Think about Joshua's words to the people. God will lead you. God will lead you. How important is that? It's like, it wasn't about Joshua saying, listen, I'm going to get you to where we're going. It was about that God is going to get you there. All the people knew was based on their experience in the wilderness. It's like, okay, this is really different, Joshua. Are you sure about this? The leadership was in transition. We learned that last week. This whole, okay, Joshua, you're the new guy in town. How do we know that you got the same message that Moses had? Well, there were obstacles. And yet there is this new generation, isn't there? This generation is going to have to learn to follow God, just like we did. It's like it's the importance of teaching, isn't it? And sharing, letting them see God at work in the lives of us, individuals. Because they have to learn to follow God. The leadership was in transition here, and yet every generation has the opportunity to do what? To trust and to follow God. Even though there are obstacles in the way, if they were going to receive what God had promised, they had to take the step of faith. So true. You want the blessings of God on your life? You have to be obedient to him. You have to take that step of faith. You have to respond. Respond. Well, notice what happens. The Levites do this. As soon as their feet touch the water, I sort of already tipped my hand here. The flow of water will be cut off upstream, and the river will stand up like a wall. The Levites had to follow God's command. In Jeremiah chapter 6 and verse 6 talks about the old paths. And you seek them out. And when you find them, walk therein, because that's the good way. The world and culture. I'm reading this book a father wrote it to his college-age daughter about all the questions that come up, about faith when you get into college. And it's just amazing, isn't it? Because that generation, that new generation, those that are coming behind us, they have to learn to trust God and learn His Word for themselves so that they can also be effective in ministry. Well, again, it is about searching out the old ways. God asked the Israelites to obey. And when they obeyed, He did what He said He would. He acted. But it took faith. You know, if I'm one of the Levites, I know you guys should be the Levites. I'd be there, hey, Joshua, I don't know about this, stepping into this water. Well, God was going to do His part if the people responded. How? In faith. In faith. And it still takes faith today. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. We have to have faith, don't we? Well, again, this seems impossible. When things look to be impossible, we serve a God of the possible. So important for us to understand that. God's power was going to be displayed because He's God. Nothing's impossible for Him. If you think about this and you look at Exodus chapter 14 and verse 13, it says this. You know this verse. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. It's all about trusting. People trust in a lot of different things. And if they would trust in God, and this is where we are the light, it makes a big difference, doesn't it? Well, how about these guys? Remember these guys? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? In Daniel chapter 3, verses 16 and 17. What do they tell the king? They're talking to the king. We're not careful to answer in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us. So they were trusting in their experiences. They had a relationship with God. So that becomes key, doesn't it? This encounter points us to the faith that was on display. It was all about faith. Faith, trust, and obedience. But what do we find in Hebrews 11 and 1? Faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. Okay, Mr. Levites, I want you to step into the water. Are you sure about this, Mr. Joshua? Yes, I'm sure. Step into the water. God will do great things. Well, we just need to trust. Well, when we examine the history of the Israelites, we do see this. We see God was faithful. He was faithful. That's all about, again, this idea, can I learn from the past? Can I learn from the past? And how do I apply the things of the past to the situation I'm in today? And you're like, well, that's hard to do, Dale. I'm not wandering in the wilderness. Well, maybe sometimes it feels like you are. Emotionally, sometimes we get into this, feeling that things are just not as they ought to be. Well, God's faithful, even when the faithfulness of the people was lacking. And if you were here Wednesday night, Levi talked a little bit about that from the book of Nehemiah, and he shared, about this lack of faithfulness of the people. Well, what we know here is that Joshua was the leader the people needed, the right person at the right time. And that's critical, isn't it? Because sometimes God will bring a leader on the scene that's needed to move His people to where He wants them to go. Earlier in the book, God tells Joshua that He will exalt him. So if you read Joshua chapter 1 and Joshua chapter 2, you find that God tells him, I'm going to exalt you. I'm going to exalt you this day in the vision of the people. Leaders. Faithful leadership matters. I'm going to say something, and it's true here, and don't tell me it's not. People are fickle. You know what fickle means? We change our minds quite a bit. We can't figure out which way to go on this day or that issue or here or there. And so what we need from leaders is that steadiness, don't we? Suppose Joshua would have said, oh, you know what? Okay, Levites, I get it. You don't want to step into the water. Well, let's just take the ark to the edge of the water. Doesn't work. It's not what God commanded. God said, step into the water, and things would happen. So as leaders need to be steady because we tend to always change our mind. We have a different idea, a different opinion, a different, pathway we think is the right way. Remember what Jeremiah 6:6 says, seek out the old paths, learn is a good way, and when you find them, walk in them. Well, Joshua was the leader that God provided. Joshua chapter 4 and verse 3 tells me this. Tell them, take 12 stones from the very place where the priests are standing in the middle of the Jordan. Carry them out and pile them up on the place where you will camp tonight. What's Joshua telling them? You're going to get across the water. And tomorrow you're going to be camping somewhere else, not in the wilderness anymore. Joshua wanted to memorialize their journey. And this is important for us to remember. I like the song, and we used to sing it a lot. Count your blessings. Name them one by one. And what will happen? It will surprise you what the Lord has done. Sometimes, again, how do we learn from the past and apply it to the future? We have to look back and we have to reflect on what God has done. Reflection is important. Well, why am I going to take stones from the middle of the Jordan? What's that all about, Joshua? Why the stones from the riverbed? Because this was literal. It was a visible representation of God's faithfulness, His patience, His power, and His guidance. Remember what the Lord has done. God's promises, God's deliverance, God's power. Great is thy faithfulness. Lamentations chapter 3, verses 22 and 23. His mercies are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. Well, again, I would challenge you this morning to look at your own life and see what God has done in your life. How He's led you when you felt like maybe you were in the wilderness and you didn't know which way to turn. How has He led you? Well, notice Joshua 4, here's the 4:1:1. So, when everyone was safely on the other side, the priests crossed over with the ark of the Lord as the people watched. So, in other words, they stayed put. God stayed put. The ark stayed put until everyone was safe on the other side. And then God moved. Well, why is this important? Because being a witness to God's work allows us to share effectively. Everyone in the room has a testimony. God has done something in your life. Maybe some of you, it's great things you can point to. Maybe some of you feel like, well, He hasn't really done anything really great in my life. He changed you. That's something great. I love what I find in John chapter 9, verse 25. This is wonderful. If you're thinking about, how do I answer when somebody asks me, they're challenging this man about Jesus, and he says to them, whether he be a sinner or no, I don't know. I know not. One thing I know, that whereas I was blind, now I see. Wow. In other words, I can't get hung up in the things that you're asking me because it really doesn't matter. What I know is what Jesus has done for me. So in the world, when you're out there witnessing and somebody takes you down a path that you don't really know the answer to, just be like this guy. I don't know. It's okay to say you don't know. Because this guy said, look, I know what God did for me. And each of you in the room know what God has done for you. Well, again, I'm almost out of time. But even the very hairs of your head are numbered. Fear not, therefore, ye are of more value than many sparrows. Luke chapter 12 and verse 7 says from the King James. Who are you trusting? The Levites had to take the first step. If you're struggling with how, what you should do with this relationship with God, I'm telling you, you've got to take the first step. And He will lead you. And the Levites crossed over after everyone had passed through the water. God knows all about us. We can trust Him. I'm out of time. Where are we going next? We're going to talk about Rahab. And you're like, Rahab? Why would we talk about her? Well, show up next week and we'll find out why. Stand and we'll go to prayer this morning. Heavenly Father, we come to you this morning. We're grateful for this time that we have to share together. We're grateful for the things we can learn from your word. They're so timely. And Lord, I just thank you again for your presence in our lives. And we thank you for good leaders, stable leadership that can steady our hand and help us as we go. We thank you for the vision of this church, Lord, to reach the community and reach others with the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's so important. Lord, I pray for the needs in the congregation this morning. There are probably many folks struggling, maybe with financial needs, spiritual needs, physical needs. Lord, you know where we are. You know what we have need of. And the scriptures say, even before we ask. And Lord, I just pray right now that you'd meet those needs in a special way. Lord, I pray that you'd be with us in the service today. Bless this, the one who preaches. Use those who sing. May the congregation be uplifted by all that's said and done. These things we pray.